You're listening to The Inspired Guide, episode 42. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Before I dive in, here is a quick little disclosure. There may be some background noise in this episode because there is still some renovations going on and the renovators are here today. So let's dive into today's topic. Today I'm going to be answering the question, hey Darlene, when's it time to evolve from a solo hosted podcast format to one that supports guests? And if I do decide to have guests on my podcast, what are some tips for getting good sound? And how do I actually go about recording guest interviews? Let me back up and differentiate between a solo podcast and a guest podcast format. So for those that might be new to podcasting or never really heard the term solo podcast, it's basically what it sounds like. It's one person talking, usually the host of the podcast, talking on a specific topic. So this episode right here would be considered a solo format. So the person will typically talk on their area of expertise or a specific topic. And guest formats are just that. They are podcast interviews where the host is interviewing a guest on their podcast and airing it for you to listen to, enjoy, and consume. Before I can answer the question, how do I know when it's time to move away from a solo podcast to a guest format? I wanted to go through some of the pros and cons of having guests on your show. So here are the pros. By having a guest on your show, you can explore an area of expertise that you're not familiar with. So maybe you have a parenting podcast and you want to talk about different ways different parenting topics. In some areas you might not be an expert in, maybe childhood psychology or childhood trauma. And so you want to invite a guest on your podcast that can explore that topic and share their expertise with you and your audience. Another benefit or pro of having guests on your show is they offer a different perspective. So take the example of someone who's a personal development coach and maybe they talk on and teach on the topic of inner critic. Well, if you are someone that is a coach and talks on that topic of inner critic, you might want to invite another life coach on your podcast that has a different perspective and different way of teaching about the subject. Guests offer a different perspective. And then finally, the third benefit I want to share here is guests allow you to expand your reach and you build relationships. You expand your reach by growing your network and meeting new people and having them on your podcast and building those relationships. But you can also expand your listener reach by having your guests promote and share your podcast episode or their podcast episode on their social media, to their email list, to all of their people, their audience, and their followers. So those are the three benefits I want to mention. There are others. And now I want to talk about some of the cons of having guests on your podcast. And these are just all things that you'll want to take into consideration when it comes to shouldn't I evolve to a guest format or not. And we'll dive into that a little bit more in a moment. So some of the cons is guest interview shows or guest format podcasts. Time is a factor. Vetting, prepping, interviewing, all of that takes time. So you'll want to consider how much time you have available in your schedule to allow for interviews. And you'll also want to consider how often you air your podcast. So if you're doing a weekly show and you want to move to a guest format, time is going to be a huge factor. Then you also want to take into consideration scheduling. This is another time-intensive task. Say that 3 times fast. This is another time-intensive task. This is another time-intensive task. This is another time-intensive task. Scheduling. First and foremost, if you do decide to start a podcast with guests and you are going to be doing interviews, I absolutely suggest you set up a scheduler. So this could be Acuity, it could be Calendly, it could be so many other calendar apps found on the web. But definitely create a calendar and then create a way for people to easily schedule an interview with you using an online-based calendar system. This will eliminate a lot of the back and forth that I actually went through in the early days because I did not have a calendar back in like 2009. It didn't dawn on me to do something like that. And so there was a lot of back and forth of, hey, I'm available on this day between these times. What works best for you? So that will cut down big time on the time it takes for scheduling. However, you do also want to determine the best times for you to sit down and do those interviews. What's the best time of day? When are you the most curious? When do you feel like you're the most present and able to do a podcast interview? And then put that availability on your podcast scheduler or your podcast interview calendar. Even if you have a calendar set up, there's still that whole time-intensive task because you're booking guests, you're following up, you're making sure that they're prepped, you're answering any questions that they might have. And then the other caveat is that you're eventually at some point going to deal with no-shows, cancellations, or reschedules. And that can wreak havoc on your episode airing schedule. So let's say you had someone scheduled for an interview tomorrow, and next week you were planning on airing that episode, and you didn't have anything else in the pipeline. Well, if they cancel or something comes up and you can't make the interview, then you're left to do what I like to call the scramble. And the scramble is not fun. It means you're scrambling to think of what you're going to do to fill in that topic. Do you not release that week? Do you do a solo episode? Do you find another guest that can jump in pretty quickly and record the interview? So those are some of the cons of having guests. And then also, as much vetting as you could do. Sometimes you just sit down, you do an interview with someone and the vibe isn't there. They're not a fit for your podcast. So then you have the whole awkward situation of, do I air? Don't I air? If I don't air the interview, what do I say to the guest? And so while, you put on your big girl or boy pants and you do what you got to do, if the episode and interview isn't going to fit, then you tell them and you break it to them. But that's just one thing that you'll need to also keep in mind, that those things happen. All of those things happen, and they will. There you go. The pros and cons of having guests on your podcast. And now I hope I haven't scared you away from having guests, because all things considered, it's time to evolve your podcast from a solo format to a guest format. If you feel a guest or guests can elevate your show, so they can offer an area of expertise that you do not know anything about. They can share a different perspective on a topic. Or having a guest can help you expand your reach and build your network, build your relationships. Relationships, mind you, that can last a lifetime. There are many people that I've had on my podcast who I'm still in touch with today, and that's going almost over 10 years. Now, I want to be clear, not all podcasts need guests. Contrary to popular belief, that's not the only format out there, specifically for businesses. You don't have to have a guest format if you don't want to. I'll say this time and again. Your podcast, your rules. If you decide that having guests on your podcast is worthwhile, there are a couple of things that you can do to, one, alleviate the stress of all of the time it takes by having guests. A lot of what my podcast clients do is alternate between a solo hosted episode one week and a guest interview the next week. So that's one idea. Another is you don't have to have weekly episodes. You can do a bi-weekly format until your time clears up and it feels more right to do a weekly interview-based show. So if you do decide, I want to give it a try, here are some tips for getting the best sound and for recording you and your guest. So for the sake of this episode, I'm talking about remote interviews where you and your guest are not in the same building together. First, I'm going to introduce to you something I like to call, and the industry, the podcast industry and audio industry likes to call the double ender. This is when you record the host, record yourself locally on your computer. So it's just like if you were sitting down to record a solo hosted episode where you plug in your microphone, you turn on an audio editing or recording software of choice, and you just start talking. Well, with a double ender, you will be doing that on your side of the conversation, and your guest will be doing the same thing on their computer from wherever they're located. So that would be the best way to get the best audio. And you can both still call in using something like Zoom or Zencastr or Squadcast so that you can have the conversation easily together, so you're not on the phone and it's awkward where you're holding a phone in one hand and you have a microphone in front of you. That's a little weird. You can definitely then just use Zoom or Zencastr, and they can be your backup. So if you're doing a double ender, I always still suggest you use something like Zoom or Zencastr, or I keep saying Zencastr, but I'm not really a fan of Zencastr. But there are other platforms out there, and I'll link to the various ways that you can record remotely for podcast interviews here in the show notes. So going back to the double ender, you will be recording yourself locally on your computer. Your guest will be recording themselves locally on their computer. You will both be using external mics, and you'll also both be using headphones or earphones or earbuds, because that will help you get the best sound possible. Now, that is the best case scenario. What usually happens is that you will be able to create your setup the best for success, but you're not always going to be able to manage the sound quality or space or any of that, or the tech savvy of your guest. So you can then just both call into Zoom and do the interview that way. However, you would still be recording your own individual track on your computer. So at least one side of the conversation has pretty good to stellar sound. The next thing is whatever service you're using, Zoom, Squadcast, Zencastr, Skype with eCam recorder, any of those, you always want to record you and your guest on individual tracks. This will enable you or your podcast editor to edit and mix and do all of that stuff so much better by having individual tracks for you and your guest. In the end, this will make your podcast sound that much better. I will include in the show notes link some information on how to set up Zoom, because by default, when it comes to Zoom, I believe the default is not to record individual tracks for each speaker. So in the show notes for this episode, I'll include a link to a video on YouTube that shows you how to do that with the latest version of Zoom. Some other things. So if you're going the Zoom route and you both can't do the double ender or you're recording locally, some other best practices for you and your guests. I've mentioned it before, but definitely wear headphones or earbuds. This will eliminate any feedback or echo that is heard through your speaker or your guest speakers. Also, always use an external mic. Always encourage them to have an external mic of some sort. And then both you and your guest should remove any and all distractions. Phone notifications, computer notifications, app notifications, all the notifications. And then any fans or background noise going on in your household, you will want to turn them off and be free of distractions. And then when you do jump on the call with your guest, don't be afraid to test the mics out, do some mic testing. In fact, I always encourage that. Let them talk a little bit, hear how their sound is, if there's any rustling, if they're wearing any bracelets or jewelry or anything that's rubbing against the mic or causing any distractions. Don't be afraid to let them know. Just always tell them that you are wanting the audio recording to have the best possible outcome, and so being free of any audio distractions is of the utmost importance. And then, along the same lines, if you are having like the world-class, most amazing interview, but then you notice that there's dogs barking in the background, or maybe their mic is rubbing up against their shirt and it's causing some really distorted sounds. Don't keep going. Pause. You don't have to necessarily interrupt them right away, but once they finish their last thought, you can say, hey, let's pause for a minute. We'll go back to that. Let's restart that question in 1 second. I noticed that there's some audio distortion or something going on, or are there dogs in the background? Let's just pause for a minute and fix that, and then we'll jump back in. So don't ever be afraid to take control of the interview and take control of your sound, because in the end, it's your podcast. You want it to have the best outcome. And why not? This is the guest's opportunity to shine, so they will be grateful to you for wanting to do that. So to wrap it all up, take into consideration the pros and cons of having guests on your podcast. And if you feel in your heart like, hey, yeah, I want to give this a try, then do it and utilize some of the tips and tools that I've mentioned for recording your podcast interview and make the best of it. I'll have a bunch of resources, information, and all that jazz in the show notes. You can pop on over to Darlene, so D as in Darlene, V as in Victoria, podcasts with an S at the end, .com, and look for episode 42's show notes. Until next time, everybody, remember, be inspired by the most important person in your life, you. This is Darlene Victoria, signing out. Oh, before you go, I would love to connect with you. You can follow me on Instagram at DV Podcasts, and you can also find me on Facebook. Just look for Darlene Victoria Digital Media.